Hi everyone, how's everyone doing? My name is David Targett. I am one of the graduate assistants in the Office of Gift Planning this upcoming school year, and I am lucky enough to have Miss Susie Pack with us today. She's an associate professor for the St. John's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, where she teaches history. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, David, for inviting me.
Of course, of course. So let's get right into it. So can you tell me and the alumni a little bit about your education background prior, or a little bit about your career prior to becoming an associate professor at St. John's?
Sure. I actually grew up in Brooklyn and Long Island. I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised. And when I graduated from high school in Long Island, I went to Dartmouth for undergrad. And I originally thought that I wanted to go to law school. And my freshman year, I took a class with a professor named Annalise Orlek, American Women's History since 1920, and switched my major to being a history major, and she became my mentor. And around my junior year, I decided that I really wanted to pursue history and go to graduate school. Not necessarily to really become a professor, but to study more. When I was in college at that time, you really didn't see many Asian American history programs. Professor Orlick did her PhD at NYU with a very, very well-known professor named Marilyn Young, who kind of wrote one of the best books on the Vietnam War. And her area of interest was not only women's history, but immigration history. So I studied immigration history with her. But I really also wanted to study the history of Asians in America. And that's what I decided to go to graduate school for. And so there's a long journey that to explain how, when I started as an Asian Americanist, which I still teach today. So this semester, for example, at St. John's, I'm teaching Asian American history. My first book was on banking. And it basically is a journey that takes place through U.S. foreign policy in East Asia. But I went to, when I applied to graduate school, when you do a PhD program, and you apply, you really apply to work with like one person, and that person is your mentor and is very important in your life, and their commitment to you is so strong that they have to also choose you. They're really taking a chance when they choose you, right? And also PhD programs are very competitive, particularly for private schools, because you receive full funding. You basically get paid to go to school. It's like, you know, it's like heaven, you know, somebody, you get paid to read and to study. And then, you know, but this creates an obligation, honestly, for you to kind of like give back and teach when you finish. So I only applied to schools where they had the top tenured Asian Americanists in the country. And at that time, there were about 5 or 6. So UCLA, Berkeley, Brown, Stanford, and Cornell. And there was also a couple at the University of Michigan. But so I went to Cornell. I got accepted to Cornell to study with Gary Okihiro, who is one of the most senior Asian American historians in the field. And I work with him, and I also work with particularly a professor named Naoki Sakai, who I did Asian studies with. He's a modern Japanese historian and philosopher, theorist. And so I did my dissertation on basically the intersection between American immigration policy during the interwar period and U.S. foreign policy in East Asia in the interwar period. And that is how I discovered investment bankers, because to encapsulate it in a very short way, you know, under Theodore Roosevelt, the United States had a foreign policy that they refer to as gunboat diplomacy, right? Which is we usually send military. And under Taft, who succeeded him, Taft's diplomacy was different, and it's referred to as what's called dollar diplomacy, where you basically leverage the debt that other governments have for American political interests. And so I was studying US foreign policy with China. And during the interwar period, there was an international banking consortium that was created called the IBC. And J.P. Morgan was the head of that group, the American group of the International Banking Consortium. And so I found out that if you want to look at U.S. foreign policy in East Asia during that time, you actually have to look at private bankers, because what the State Department did is they did not lend money directly to governments like China. Instead, what would happen is that private bankers like J.P. Morgan, Kuhn-Loeb and Company, which was J.P. Morgan's primary competitor, was a German Jewish bank founded in the U.S., would lend money to countries like China, and then the State Department would kind of leverage that relationship, that private debt, for American political interests. And so that's how I kind of encountered the world of bankers.
Right.
And then that led to the publication of my first book.
Awesome. And so you touched on your book already, and that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about. You have a book called Gentlemen Bankers, The World of J.P. Morgan, which was published in 2013.
Yes.
Yes. Can you tell me a little bit more about the book, like kind of what your intention was in writing it? What were you trying to open your readers' eyes to?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. So I think that really all historical monographs start with what is the question, right? All historians have a question that we want to find the answer to. And in the case of Gentlemen Bankers, it started off from my dissertation, but it's actually very different from my dissertation. So in my dissertation, imagine that I'm studying US foreign policy in East Asia. I'm studying how it intersects with US immigration policy in East Asia, because basically what happens is that J.P. Morgan, the nation of Japan, becomes a client of the Morgans after the First World War. And during that time, the United States in 1917 and 1924 passed two immigration acts that are quite discriminatory and directed towards exclusion of Japanese, in a way that tried to mimic the exclusion of Chinese that had taken place in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882. It was a congressional act. It had to be renewed every 10 years, but it was made permanent in 1902 until 1943, when China became an ally of the United States during the Second World War. But it was the first act that actually discriminated against a group of people on the basis of their race and ethnicity. There was an entire documentary series about it actually about 2 years ago called The Exclusion Act, and a wonderful series called Asian Americans that came out on PBS as well. But so Japan was quite annoyed by these immigration acts, because they felt that it damaged their reputation, frankly, their international reputation. And so they communicated this to their bankers. And J.P. Morgan, being the banker, this is their client. You can see in the letters of, for example, one of their senior partners, where they would be writing to the State Department saying, can we not openly exclude Japan? Can we put them on some kind of quota? And this mimics an agreement that Theodore Roosevelt had called the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan in 1907, where Japan agreed not to send laborers to the US, basically to restrict emigration. And the United States agreed not to formally exclude them like the Chinese had been excluded. So imagine I'm working on this dissertation, and one of the things that I discover is that there are two main banking groups that are at the top of investment banking in America. There's J.P. Morgan, and there's a whole group of Boston Brahmin banks, Lee Higginson and Company, for example. And then there's a group of German Jewish banks. The top bank in that group is a bank called Kuhn-Loeb and Company, which was led by a man named Jacob Schiff. He was the son-in-law of one of the founders. And it was really J.P. Morgan's only competitor. Now, private banks in this period, what they did, because remember, the United States is still a creditor nation. It doesn't become a debtor nation. It doesn't become a creditor nation until really after the First World War, right? So it needs capital. So it is bringing that capital in from Europe, where European investors are trying to channel their savings into American investments. But in order to do that, they need to know that it's safe, right? This is the period of the late Gilded Age with the boom of the railroads, right?
Sorry,
At the time,
one quick
right?
question.
Yeah.
Why, just for like clarification, why would the Europeans be ciphering their money into the United States banks? Were the banks in the United States offering higher interest rates, like along those lines?
Right, it's a question of risk, exactly. It's a question of risk and profit, right? So they're looking for profitable returns. And the United States industry, this is the period of industrialization, right? The last 3 decades of the 19th century is the period of industrialization of the United States. And it is booming, right? This is also a period in which we have 25 million immigrants coming in from Europe, fueling this industrialization. And so they're seeing that opportunity for growth, right? And so Morgan finances the first billion-dollar corporation, U.S. Steel, in 1901. And so they look to private investment banks. And remember, these are not commercial banks. These are not like deposit. These are investment banks where they're looking for opportunities to invest, and they rely on private bankers like J.P. Morgan or Jacob Schiff to indicate to them what is a good investment, right? And so they're part of their trust from the investors. And of course, they also had American investors. For private bankers is that private bankers in this period, and actually for a long time, really until the late 60s, and it starts from a British merchant banking tradition, it actually goes all the way back to Florence, were what they call, by their nature, they were unlimited liability. So you are basically putting your own money on the line when it's not like a corporation where you have limited liability, right? And so the idea is that if a private banker is recommending something, they have their skin in the game, and you can't really know anything about their business because they're private, but you can see the way that the men live, their reputation, that they've been in business a long time, that you have these family networks, they're part of the community, you know, they're part of the social institutions of the society and so on. And so it's all basically a business based on trust. I mean, banking fundamentally is a business based on trust, right? But particularly for private banking. So imagine I'm studying this community and I'm looking at their financing of East Asian companies, like Japan, for example. So Kun Lo figured in because during the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese sent an emissary to Europe to raise money for the Japanese war effort against Russia in 1904. They sent a guy named Kurokiro Takahashi, and he met Schiff in London. And Schiff hated the Russian Tsar because of pogroms against the Jews. And so they formed an alliance between Japan and Kun Lo to basically finance Japan's war effort against Russia. And Japan wins in 1905. It's a very short war, relatively, you know, in history. And after that, Schiff becomes Japan's foreign banker. And this remains the case until the First World War, when Russia becomes an ally of the Allies, right, of Britain and France against Germany. And then after that, Schiff actually breaks formal ties with Japan. They maintain personal ties with, now he's a baron, Takahashi. But so within this realm of East Asian financiers, right, or American banks who are financing East Asian projects, like railroads and so on, you have these two powerhouses. You have J.P. Morgan, you have Kun Lo. Now, J.P. Morgan was a very prominent Episcopalian layman.
Okay.
And Kun Lo was an extreme, and Jacob Schiff was a very prominent German Jewish figure. Yeah. Right. And so one of the things that really interested me, that kind of I knew in the back of my head when I was working on my dissertation, but it's like a question that starts here and that slowly moves up to the front of your head, was I said, we know that in this early part, in the late 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, there was actually a lot of anti-Semitism towards Jewish Americans. And And we also know that J.P. Morgan himself was not immune to these ideas, right? And so his bank was entirely, really, yes, really with one exception until like the 1940s, Protestant, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, native born, largely. I think honestly with only two exceptions in 1938. And then you had Kuhn Loeb, which was every single person in Kuhn Loeb was related to another partner until 1912, right? And so one of the things about a business like private banking that's really based on reputation, that for Schiff and Kuhn Loeb, they could not do business with somebody who was anti-Semitic, openly anti-Semitic, because it would reduce their reputation. It was kind of like their self-pride, right? And in fact, there was the president of a railroad who was known as being very anti-Semitic, and in a letter that Schiff wrote, this is a wonderful letter in the American Jewish Archives, he says, "We cannot do business with him, able as he may be, as a businessman, because of what it would say about us," right? So they had to protect their reputation. And so we know from other correspondence that J.P. Morgan, for example, referred to his firm as a white firm. And this was a period in which Jewishness was identified, even by Schiff, as a race. I mean, the ideas about race change over time, right? So I want to say that even in his usage of it, it's not necessarily what we think of it as today. But he was very, very proud to be Jewish. And there was the other thing too, is that private banking is such a personal business, because when you underwrite and take on a very large deal for, let's say, a railroad, right? They need $10 million. You can't keep all that risk yourself.
No.
Right? You have to share it with you have to have friends. That's what the syndicate is, right? So you have to share it with other people. And so the question is, how do you know who your friends are and who to trust?
Right.
In the context, particularly of the importance of reputation, and also in the context of anti-Semitism. So the question that I had at Gentlemen Bankers was, what is the basis of trust in this world of banking between private bankers in America, given what's happening in American society? How does the banking community actually function? And one of the first things that I did that kind of makes the book unique is I actually tested. I don't like to assume things, so I actually tested. I said, well, people have said, like Vincent Carrozzo, who's a wonderful business historian. He probably knew more about the Morgans than anybody alive. He taught at NYU for a very long time, and his papers are actually kept at the Morgan Library, you know, where the house is in the museum on between 36th and 37th Street on Madison Avenue. I spent years there doing research. And he said, well, in his mind, the question of trust was based on that they had this respect for each other, which they absolutely did. And he said that they did a lot of work together. Now, most people would look at the question that I posed and say, Susie, the answer is money, right? The reason why they worked together is because it made them money. It was profitable, right? And so I said, well, let's test this. And so in the Morgan Library, they have these 11 syndicate books. They're huge. They're like this big. I'm short, so I had to stand to kind of read them. And what I did is I looked at, and it basically gives every syndicate that the Morgans did, and also deals that were given to it by other banks, including Kuhn Loeb. And it told you who was given what participation, and also what the profit was, who the client was, and so on. And so what I did is I looked at that as a document. Mm-hmm. And this is what happens when historians go to archives. The archives themselves are not going to give you the information. You have to look at the document and say, what can this tell me? Right. When I looked at it, I said, this is basically like their Facebook. This is like their friend list. And if I can take this apart and analyze it in a way, I can see what their friendship network looked like. And I would be able to tell you how much work they did with Jewish banks versus other banks. So we could test whether or not actually Carrozzo was correct in saying, yes, they did do a lot of work together.
Was he right?
And so he was, yes. So if it took me 3 years. And so if I had finished the translation, it was a giant Excel project. And I looked at it and I looked at, whether you're an insurance company, commercial bank, and individual. And in the book, it's just like one chart. It's all condensed into like 3 charts. Those 3 charts literally represent, literally years of work. I mean, hours and days and months and years of work. But now I can answer these questions for you. So yes, they absolutely did a lot of work with Kuhn Loeb. But the average profit for any deal that they did with Kuhn Loeb was actually lower
than the average.
Than the average of all their deals. So the way that they made money was in the consistency of their relationship. So I also looked at the variety of their clients. For example, for Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank has a pretty respectable showing over a period. So it's over a period of 40 years. It's 1895 to 39 years until 1934, when Glass-Steagall basically forces the Morgans to choose. Are you going to be an investment bank and continue underwriting, or are you going to be a commercial bank? And they actually decided to go the commercial bank route. Kuhn Loeb decided to remain an investment bank. Right. So after 1934, the J.P. Morgan and Company stopped underwriting, but that's when Morgan Stanley was formed. Right. That's when that became the investment bank. And some people saw that as like a subterfuge to kind of get around the law, because 3 of the Morgan partners moved over into Morgan Stanley. And in fact, they had quite close relationships as long as the generation of partners. Again, it's a very personal business, knew each other. Henry Sturgis Morgan, who was J.P. Morgan's grandson, was the principal there, right? William Ewing and also Harold Stanley. And so when you look at that activity over a period of 40 years, then you can start to see the patterns of who participated when. So let's say if I had just the totals, right, of how much participation you had for a 40-year period, Deutsche Bank might look pretty good, because it could have been like, I'm making this number up, I can't remember at the time. Let's say it was 70 million, right? Right? But what if your deals for Deutsche Bank were only for the Northern Pacific Railroad? You never got another syndicate deal for anything else, and they were only for a certain period of time, like 1890. Then this indicates that it wasn't Morgan's relationship that was super strong to Deutsche Bank, it was the client. That the clients insisted, right, that Deutsche Bank be included in these deals. So I look at the variety of clients, I look at who the clients were, I broke it up into 5-year periods to see, for example, it was a very well-known, more senior German Jewish bank called Speyer & Company. It was started by a German immigrant by the name of Philip Speyer, who came from a very well-established banking family in Frankfurt. And I believe it was his nephew, James, who was American-born, becomes the principal. And James has terrible relationships with the Morgans. He doesn't even necessarily have good relationships with other German Jewish banks, but they, were in the community together. In around 1904, and one of the reasons why it's called gentleman bankers, the whole term of gentleman bankers is basically the idea, and this is, I think Schiff expressed it the best, is that you have enough respect for yourself, right, that you don't chase after the business of your competitor.
Right.
That it was basically a way to establish limits on competition. That's why it's called gentleman banking, right? But it was.
Sorry. Do these same principles exist today? Like, have you seen? Is banking still built upon that fundamental idea of trust, or is it now more leaning towards the chasing of capital and the maximizing profit at all costs, regardless of if you're doing business with someone who you don't trust? Is it more profit now?
An excellent question, and it's actually one that I address in my third book that I'm working on now. But it's something, for example, that I asked Henry Kaufman. Henry Kaufman is a very well-known financier. He's also a very big supporter of economic history. He has like a name chair at Columbia. He has another one at NYU.
Doesn't he
And
do all the textbooks?
yes, exactly.
Okay.
That's right. So he's also a writer, right? So extremely intellectual economist, and loves history. So he actually gave a presentation at the Business History Conference, which is a major kind of business history association in the United States, but it's international. And I asked him this question. I said, do you think relationships still matter in banking and investment banking? And he was like, no. Right. But then he just, you know, and you know, a lot of the conversation, for example, around the financial crisis asked this, right? About banks still having skin in the game, and about, you know, how the banking industry has changed. You know, most investment banks today, I think actually all of the big investment banks today are no longer private partnerships.
Okay.
The last to change over was Goldman Sachs. Now, there is still Brown Brothers Harriman, though technically right after Glass-Steagall, they, from what I understand, they chose to remain a commercial bank, but they are a private bank, still a large and very old private bank.
Quick question, just to clarify something.
Yes.
When you say that there are no more private banks, like you said, or very few, the last one was Goldman, you said? Does that
No,
mean-
I said the large private investment banks.
Okay.
So
private anymore.
I should clarify. I did a project several years ago with the Museum of American Finance, where we looked at the syndicate that underwrote the Ford Motor Company's IPO in 1956. And these were like the top American, actually, and Canadian investment banks in mid-century. And of those, most have gone out of business. That's the first thing, right? Of the brokerage houses and American banks. And then Goldman was kind of the last holdout to go public, because there was a wave. This is one of the things that I'm myself still analyzing and studying for the third book. When private banks went from being partnerships to corporations in the late 60s and then into the 70s. I can't remember what I was talking about.
We were talking about like the principle of, is banking still built on that foundation of trust?
Oh, right. Yes. You know, it is a really important question. I think it's such an, I do not have an answer for you, but it's kind of the question that I'm attending to, because also one of the things I'm interested in is how the makeup of the banking community has changed since mid-century.
It's definitely
yes,
changed.
yeah.
And I'm sure that's
so
had a big impact.
Yes, exactly. So Gentleman Bankers looks at private investment banking basically from 1895 until the Second World War. And it only really looks at like the top sliver. That's why it's called the World of J.P. Morgan, right? So when I did the museum project on the Ford Motor Company's IPO, so I did a genealogy of about 207 banks and investment banks and brokerage houses. One of the reasons I did the project is, one, I wanted to familiarize myself better with banks across regions in the United States, you know, like all across the United States, because the Ford Motor Company was such a popular IPO. They had not gone public. They basically had to wait until Henry Ford died in order to go public, because he lived a very long time, because he was so against it. In the early part of the history of his firm, there were people outside the family who owned shares, including the Dodge brothers, who were, you know, where that comes from, who were minority shareholders, and they sued him because he did not give out a dividend one year, and he was so mad that he bought back all the shares and then took the company private.
Wow.
Yes, so he and you know, he was a very strong-willed person, a very complex person, and so and there was a power struggle over the firm after his son. He only had one son named Edsel, right? Who the car was named after, and who died very young, actually. from stomach cancer in his early 40s. It's very tragic. And then there was a power struggle within the firm, and then his grandson Henry Ford II is eventually becomes the head of not only the motor company, but also takes his father's and his family's position as the head of the board of the Ford Foundation. And it was actually the Ford Foundation's shares that were taken public.
Okay.
Yes. So there's a whole reason why the Ford Foundation was created and why it had the number of shares that it did. And it was really to get around, honestly, tax law, inheritance law in the 1930s during the Great Depression.
Right.
So they imbued the foundation with shares, but that were non-voting, and the family kept the voting shares so that if any one of them died, they wouldn't have to pay the inheritance tax and then lose control of the actual firm. So, but that was one of the reasons why I agreed to do the project on the Fords, not only because, you know, the Ford is such an interesting company, but because I wanted to familiarize myself more with how banking worked in actually mid-century. But then what I do in each genealogy is I kind of follow each firm to the end to see what happened to them and who replaces many of them are either single proprietorships or they're family partnerships. And so one of the things I was interested in is this kind of generational change that you see from the family-led firm to it could be still a partnership, but is no longer led by the founding family. And so I'm very interested in that tradition and how that happens.
Right. Okay. It sounds like everyone needs to read your book, for one.
Thank you. I'm always shocked. I'm always shocked when people say they've read my book. I'm like, thank you.
I mean, it's something that interests me. But I wanted to ask a little bit about now your time as a professor at St. John's. What, I guess, principle are you trying to teach, or like what is the main goal you're trying to get your students to see when you're teaching them about history? And are you focused more on like what you talk about in your book? Like, do you do a lot of like banking history and the development of like our economy, or you said when you were at Cornell you were very into women's history?
Yes.
Or is that more the path you go down with teaching the students here at St. John's?
Well, in terms of the kind of classes that I teach classes in American history. So this semester, for example, I'm teaching Asian American history. I also teach the U.S. History Survey after the Civil War. Next semester, I'll be teaching basically the Age of Reform, so the Progressive Period. And so, but I've also taught on the Great Depression, and I've also taught the history of or history through film. One of I worked at a documentary film company while I was in graduate school as well. And so the kind of classes and the topics that we teach tend to be defined by the discipline itself in terms of chronology, or in many ways it can be bound also by the nation state, you know. So I'm known as like an Americanist, for example. Even though there is a movement within that really started in the 60s, but it's growing to look at history more globally, I should say, or to look at it through kind of thematic lenses, like the history of capitalism or the history of colonialism. What do I try to teach the students? Honestly, to me, history is all about thinking. Is thinking about historicizing the categories that we're given. So for example, in the class that I'm teaching now on Asian American history, one of the questions that I ask students to think about is what those different terms mean, like how Asian has been defined historically, or how Asian American has been defined historically. And one of the things I really try to do is to teach students about the discipline of history itself. So another class I'm teaching is actually a graduate class that's on quantitative methods in the study of history and historical analysis, where I talk and show different methods I use in the archive, and we read historians that look at, for example, the use of social network analysis and the analysis of the East India Company, or the Medici clan in Florence, and but it's all about thinking about what it is that we're doing, the categories that we use. So, for example, in terms of one of the things that I learned, primary text in women's history is a book by Joan Bullock Scott, who teaches at Princeton, called Gender and the Politics of History. And so it looks at how, when as academics and as historians, we bring certain understandings to how we understand our subject. Mm-hmm. And actually, what history allows us to do is to historicize those terms, mm-hmm. right? To say, what is the meaning of gender? What is the meaning of a term like woman over time, right? It changes, honestly. So, for example, I'm working on this project right now on the history of St. John's. And that's one of the reasons why my book on banking got pushed to the back burner, because I've been working on this project on the history of St. John's. And one of the questions that I ask in that project is, it's kind of a riff on St. John's slogan, "We are St. John's," but the project is called "Who was St. John's?"
Right.
So, for example, in the late 19th century, when St. John's was first founded, the "we" of St. John's was all boys.
Right.
Right, because there were no girls who were allowed. So the "we" is a gendered "we," well, it's right, and that changes over time. Mm-hmm. So for us to say, what is St. John's, it's actually something that you can track, and you can see that from the historical evidence. And that's what really history helps you do. It helps you think about the things that we take for granted.
Right.
Right, and it helps you think about how it is we say we know what it is we know, because we are really limited, but I think in a necessary way, by the evidence that we have. That's the other thing that defines our discipline, right? We don't make things up,
right?
We have to be able to prove what it is that we know. We have to be able to show and make an argument for why we make the case that something is this should be interpreted this way, something should be interpreted this way. And that's the other thing that I really try to convey, honestly, is how exciting and fun that is. I know that recently people have been making statements and saying, there are so many difficult issues that, people feel afraid to talk about, given the climate and live in and so on, and events that have been happening. And I'm like, that's exactly what history is for. Mm-hmm. Right? That's what the whole journey of studying and learning is meant for, frankly. Right? So I think that's the reason why I very quickly moved from, though I have to say I'm very interested in studying the history of law. Yeah. But why it was that I became a historian, because as a discipline, that is something that asks us to really think about what it is that we say that we know and don't know, what we include and we don't include, what perspective we use, what definitions we use. It's really all about what, it's fashionable to say it's critical thinking, but it really is about learning how to think. Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to kind of just figure out how we got here today, Yes. Like that's a huge thing. Like, if none of the events happened in the past, like, who knows how today would be shaped or how today would look. Everything,
yes,
it has directly somewhat affected the way the world is today.
Yes, and I'll give you a really good example about that, is that even, so for example, with St. John's, the history project that I'm working on St. John's history, started because I was appointed to this task force on diversity in 2006. And it started because I asked, well, what exactly do we mean by diversity, right? And I said, well, really diversity is like a historical term. What does it mean for St. John's? So if we just look at the issue of co-education, for example, and I'm going to talk about this more at length in a lecture that's coming out in October, where I introduce the history project, and I talk about like how it's organized and how it started, is that, today most New York universities, let's look like New York universities are co-ed.
Yeah.
Right? But in the 19th century, if we looked at, for example, Fordham, St. John's, NYU, Columbia, these were all, for City College, these were just boys, right?
Yeah.
So over the course of the 20th century, all of them went co-ed, right? But they don't go co-ed exactly at the same time.
Right.
Right? So like Columbia doesn't go co-ed until 1983, right? St. John's doesn't go fully co-ed, St. John's College, until like 1968. So there is a variation in when things happen that tells you that the backstory is different for each institution. Right. So when you said, you know, where we are today depends on what happened before, that story is really unique. It's not inevitable, is what I'm saying, right? So that's one of the things that we trace in history is how it happened, when it happened, why it happened, where it happened. All of that specificity really matters to history because the variety tells us something, right? So it doesn't happen here, but it happens here. Why?
Right. Well, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time today to sit down and have this great conversation. I know I enjoyed it. I'm sure our alumni will enjoy it. So just a huge thank you to you for taking the time to sit down today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course.